everyone, welcome to our podcast, You Can't Spell Horror Without HR, the podcast where we dive deep into the spine-chilling, hair-raising, and sometimes downright baffling world of human resources. I'm your host, Chris Timol, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brianna Grimes, and every episode, we'll unravel real-life HR tales that will make you question if they are straight out of a horror movie or just another day in the office. From hiring nightmares to office politics gone awry, we'll discuss it all, offering insights, advice, and hopefully a few laughs around the way. So whether you're an HR professional, a manager, or just someone who's curious about the behind-the-scenes drama of the workplace, grab your headphones, dim the lights, and let's get started, because in the world of HR, every day can be a thriller. Brianna, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. It's been a great week. I'm ready to talk about some HR stuff.
Let's talk HR. Okay, so I've got two stories for you.
All right.
You know what? Pick one. I got two, left hand or my right hand?
Oh, let's go right hand.
Ooh, okay. You're going to like this one. Workplace drama and termination. Now, I must tell you, all of you listeners, and thank you for tuning in. This podcast is sponsored by PuzzleHR. These are stories, none of these stories have happened to our customers that we know of. These are all solicited from folks out there who have given us their HR horror stories. So this one I liked. So at a former workplace, and I'm just reading as it's written. So
all right.
At a former workplace, we had wrapped up a thorough investigation for several instances of sexual harassment. It was clear he needed to go. But the universe has a strange sense of humor. The same week we plan to let him go, Mr. Unaware applies for a promotion. My HR buddy and I, both HR generalists, got thrown into a bizarre scenario. Our higher-ups, the HR manager and the big shot facility director, hatched his plan for my colleague to interview the guy for the promotion, just hours before dropping the termination bomb. My buddy was like, seriously? But the facility director's reason? Yeah, we just want to mess with them. The cherry on top, our HR manager, while off-site, even sent over the exact HR interview template she wanted us to use. Talk about being in on the joke. I mean, come on. So they went through this charade of an interview, and right when it was showtime for the termination, Mr. Facility Director conveniently does the I Dream of Jeannie and ghosts, leaving us, the poor HR folks, to handle the aftermath. During the termination, our guy was obviously livid. And honestly, who could blame him? He's like, why this interview circus if you're just going to fire me? And we're just there taking the heat, knowing full well this wasn't our idea. I'm looking at your face and you're like, you got to be kidding me.
Oof. Yeah, just big oof all the way around with this one.
Now, just when you think the drama has peaked, the plot takes a wild turn.
Right? I can't imagine there's more. All right, let's see what happens.
Right. So half an hour after his exit, he storms back in with, you guessed it, an AR-15. Company has no official lockdown, but the two colleagues, two HR generals, jumped into action, trying to keep everyone safe while dialing 911. By some miracle, everyone stayed unharmed, but the emotional damage ran deep.
Wow,
Right?
Yeah.
Adding to the plot, but wait, there's more. We later found out he was grappling with personal demons. His wife had left him, taken their 4 kids, all in the same week as his termination. I mean, it was like a tragic novel.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Perfect storm for sure.
You know, I kind of feel bad for the guy, except for the sexual harassment piece of it. It's got him into this piece in the place in the first place. But this story continues. When we confronted our HR manager about the ill-timed interview prank, she, in a jaw-dropping twist, claimed she thought it was an interview about the harassment allegations, not the promotion. You can cue the collective eye roll, right? Really, like everyone called this lady out. Even the previous facility director admitted his role in the stunt. And obviously, why would they interview somebody on a case that was just closed? Anyway, the next day, the plot thickens, I guess. The next day, her boss rolls up to the facility. What does she do? She's blowing up our phones, trying to get the scoop on why her boss was snooping around. And And as for any comeuppance that this HR director faced, who knows? We don't know what happened. Unfortunately, we don't know. The story ends. She was the boss, and that's above my pay grade. And it ends. All I can say, it was a roller coaster of a week.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, so much to unpack there. You've got the investigation, you've got an inner office, prank went terribly wrong. You got an employee battling their own personal issues at home, brought that into the workplace, endangered other people, and then that kind of, no resolve of what's going to happen to the leadership that, thought that this was a good idea. That's a lot. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to start unpacking first?
You know what? Let's go with this one. Let's go. How can HR departments ensure that they handle sensitive issues like terminations with empathy and professionalism to prevent, misunderstandings or escalations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of it just comes down to being as transparent as you can in the moment. So for this particular example, I think one of the big mistakes that they made is whenever you're investigating someone for anything, whether it's sexual harassment, theft, just anything, best practice is to really have that employee be on suspension, especially if you feel like they are a harm to others or themselves or could potentially be threatening an employee's safety. And oftentimes in sexual harassment situations, the victim does feel like their safety at work is threatened, especially if it's a supervisor subordinate sexual harassment situation. So a lot of the times just putting that person on suspension while you're investigating until the conclusion and you can give them the results of the investigation, that usually allows for things like what happened in this situation not to happen, right? He wouldn't have been able to apply for a promotion. He wouldn't have been able to be interviewed. There wouldn't have been that opportunity for management to pull a very inappropriate prank simply because he wouldn't have been at work. So that's really kind of one of the big misses in this situation was that would have, I think, cleared up a lot of this. And then when it comes to terminations, just in general, I mean, part of being in HR is having that empathy and that understanding that, yes, we are terminating an employee, a position, but it's also someone's life. It's their livelihood. They're not going to be paid anymore. Like they're not going to have a job. They're going to have to go home, tell their families and kind of pick up the pieces, whether we think their termination is deserved or not. There is that empathy piece of just kind of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, being as transparent as you can. Like I said, trying to keep a very neutral tone, not being accusatory or judgmental at all, and really just state the facts. You're going to get employees that are going to be angry and they're going to react, and you're going to get other employees that, might just take it and process it later. The empathy is really a key piece, I think, to being an HR professional, especially this day and age.
Yeah, that's good insight, good input, and you're right. I mean, when I read this one, I was like, well, why would you do that?
Yeah.
Especially the HR person. And I could see the what was he, the shop foreman or the office, whatever that other individual was. I could see the guy that's in it just to mess with them. I could see that, but an HR person, come on, that's not great for the profession. All right. So talk about, now the guy shows up with a gun. What procedures or protocols should a company have in place for emergencies or potential threats in a workspace? And how should employees be trained on them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something we're getting asked more and more nowadays, just with, things that are happening in the world space right now, not even just the workspace itself. And this is something that companies really have to be prepared for. I mean, we get clients asking us all the time about active shooter training and bomb threat training and things like that, because it happens. It's part of our reality and we need to prepare for it. And there's a lot of really great options in terms of training your employees and making them aware. So having an emergency situation training at least once a year with your employees is fantastic. A lot of companies lump it in with their fire drills and their fire training. People don't know this, but organizations can actually partner with their local fire and police departments, and they will come on site and they will actually do trainings most of the time free of charge. So you can have police officers come on site and talk about what you should and should not do in the event of an active shooter. Where would be the best places to duck and cover? They'll talk about the don't be a hero mentality. Make sure that you call 911, allow the professionals to handle it. On the fire side, the firefighters will usually help you demonstrate how to use a fire extinguisher, and they'll kind of help HR facilitate those types of training and activities. But as far as like active shooter situations, it's very imperative that everybody understands what to do, because a lot of the times injuries are incurred when someone panics or they don't know what to do, or they make a mistake simply because they don't have the knowledge in terms of, you know, what could trigger an individual and kind of what to do. So partnering with your local police and firefighters is a great way to get training for your company. There's a lot of professional resources out there. If you're a little bit larger company, you have maybe more risks, more possibilities of those types of threats happening depending on how large you are. And there's a ton of companies out there that specialize in active shooter, emergency situation, bomb threat training for key individuals in the company. So leaders, and honestly, people like receptionists, anybody whose desks are near the front door, they're probably the ones that need to be having the most extensive training, because they're going to be the ones who see it, probably suspect it first. So those types of training opportunities are really great for companies to talk about it, put a plan in place, and have that support from people who understand what they're doing.
Yeah, that's really great advice. I did not know that or think about that. Going to the local authorities, fire and police for that sort of makes sense, right? Who else would you go to?
Yeah.
All right, last one on this one is, how can HR departments create a culture of accountability, especially when leadership makes questionable or unethical decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's hard because I feel like cultures of accountability, well, first and foremost, I feel like there is this myth in the world right now that HR is like the key to culture. And while HR can drive the culture, we can define the culture, we can train on the culture, we can embed the culture into new hires. Really, it's up to the leaders in the company to drive that culture and really embody that culture.
Yeah.
Because if employees don't see it coming from the leaders, it's not something that they're going to perpetuate, because it's like, if the leadership doesn't do it, why should I? It can't be a do as I say, not as I do mentality anymore, especially with the new generations that are coming into the workforce. Like, frankly, they're not having it. They're like, you either walk the walk or I walk. Sorry. And so I think companies are going to have to start adopting more of a no tolerance policy regardless of what your position is. So when you have these leaders, HR manager, director of ops, or plant manager, or whatever, making these decisions, I think companies need to start taking a firmer stance, and they need to start figuring out whether those people are a good fit for the organization long term, because a culture can absolutely build a company up and push it forward, or a culture can tear you down and really devastate a company's overall ability to be productive when you have that kind of negativity floating around, when employees see key leaders getting away with things simply because of their title. So we are starting to see this shift in just overall employment culture, where the workforce that is coming into the workplace is not going to turn the blind eye that I think people have in the past, because status has been more important than having that ethical moral compass and that values that drive and truly root a company.
Yeah. I mean, that's so true. I mean, it just, hypocrisy is so obvious.
Yeah.
And as a leader in an organization, you absolutely 100% of the time have got to walk the talk. If you've got company values, we've got our values here at Puzzle. If you've got company values and you push those out to the team, if you don't have a gold star on each one of them, right?
Yeah.
It screams. It doesn't hint. It screams of hypocrisy. So that's good. That's good advice.
And the thing is, too, is it doesn't just affect your internal employees anymore, right? Like, people forget there's social media now. Employees can tweet it, they can Glassdoor it, they can LinkedIn it, they can Facebook it, they can Instagram it. I mean, this could potentially affect your customers, your vendors, your key partners, your referral partners. I mean, this information doesn't just stay internal like it used to. It's not just rumors being spread. There's evidence that can be published. And once it's out there, it's out there. Like, good luck taking something off the internet once it's there. So that's another thing from a PR standpoint. Companies really need to realize how damaging these types of situations can be when that culture is just so prevalent and everybody knows it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know of an organization that they had that really bad culture and that high turnover and weren't able to keep replacements. Like you'd hire people and you know hire somebody, they're in there for 6 months and realize, you know what, this place is, and then they tap out, and the poor recruiting department, which is they're the ones that see it, like the
Yeah.
constant turnover. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Culture,
Yeah.
culture can kill.
Yep.
This podcast is brought to you by PuzzleHR. You've got the horror stories, we've got the resources to help. Learn more at puzzlehr.com/podcast. Now back to the show.
Are you ready for story number 2, Grimes?
Let's do it. Let's do left hand story.
All right, left-hand story. Here we go. All right, so first, trigger warning: someone does get killed in this one. So this is a true.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a true horror story, unfortunately.
Well, I chose right then. I'm glad we chose like this first one to build up to this one. So
Yeah.
let's see. Yeah, let's see how the left story goes.
Okay, so again, I'm reading this in whatever person this is, first person. This wasn't me. this was sent to me. Okay, so when I started my first job, the owner, who was also my direct boss, was meticulous about everything. One day, he began prepping me about an impending remote vacation he was taking. "You'll have to hold down the fort," he'd say. That was my boss voice.
I like it. It's a good boss voice.
"You'll have to hold down the fort," he'd say, emphasizing his inaccessibility during the trip. As a token of his appreciation, he handed me tickets to the local baseball game. St. Louis, I think this place was. So she's going to see the Cardinals. "Take a breather, leave early, and enjoy the game with your husband," he suggested. I rarely ever left work early, but I decided to heed his advice, considering the whirlwind week that lay ahead with him being gone. On the day of the game, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed a police car parked outside. Curiosity piqued. I inquired with our receptionist, but she was as clueless as I was. Moments later, an officer entered seeking one of our most exemplary employees. Punctual, diligent, well-dressed, the epitome of professionalism. My boss assured me that probably a minor misunderstanding. Given his character, it can't be serious, he remarked. Taking my word, I left for the game. Settling into our seats, I absentmindedly scrolled through my phone while a breaking news headline caught my eye. Our business was in the spotlight. A missing local teen's body had been discovered around our premises. Panic ensued. Though it was long past business hours, the facility was abuzz with evening training sessions. Calls flooded my phone, and I rushed back to work to discover that our exemplary employee had been arrested in connection with the murder.
Wow.
Yeah. With my boss unreachable on his flight, I became the point of contact. I found myself liaising with police, handing over attendance reports and other crucial data until almost midnight. The ripple effect was palpable. Concerned students, anxious sponsors, and alarmed staff needed answers. Media were parked outside, and the neighboring businesses were uncomfortable with the unwanted attention. But the hardest moment was meeting with the grieving family, wanting to see where their 19-year-old son's life had tragically ended. The following week was a nightmare, a maelstrom of legal consultations, media scrutiny, and emotional confrontations. 3 years later, the truth came out in court. Our exemplary employee had committed that heinous act during his lunch break, hiding the evidence in a makeshift grave nearby. He was sentenced and remains in prison to this day. I've since moved on from that job, but the memories of that week remain etched in my mind. It was without a doubt the most harrowing experience of my career, and one I'd never wish on anyone.
Wow. Yeah, that is an HR horror story to be certain, and that breaks my heart. Just having that situation happen at work, that's got to be really, really difficult. I mean, it's hard enough when your boss goes on vacation and you kind of step into shoes that don't really fit yet, but
Right.
then having something that big happen in addition to your boss being gone and having to make those calls, that's heavy stuff. It's really hard.
Yeah, that's absolutely a wild story.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the HR aspects of it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, background checks and employee screenings. Like, how robust should employment screenings be? Are they comprehensive enough to detect potential behavior or criminal patterns?
Yeah, background checks are something that I think a lot of employers really struggle with, especially because there's so much regulation at the state level. So if you're a multi-state employer, you know exactly what I'm talking about
Mhm.
because there's so much diversity. For the most part, background checks are pretty good, kind of raising the right red flags. When it comes to hiring, background checks have to apply to the job that they're taking. So, for example, and this is just a very basic example, if someone is not in a financial role with a company, you couldn't justify pulling a credit check for someone driving a vehicle for you unless that vehicle was full of money. So it does have to relate to their job. So people that typically work with children, more extensive background checks, a lot less regulation there because they want you to have more information from that background check than other positions that may not require it. People who do drive cars for a company, you're going to be able to get more information and use more information from like their DMV check or their background check revolving things like DUIs because it relates specifically to the role. So that's kind of the key thing to take into consideration here. The other thing is that really background checks don't give us any indication on someone's current mental health state, right? Just because they don't have a background check that came up with anything on it doesn't mean that people aren't capable of threatening your organization in one way or the other. And I think that's where kind of what we talked about earlier, culture really comes into place. Having employees that feel like they can go to HR or go to a leader and say, hey, Sally's acting a little weird lately, or hey, Frank took a really long lunch the other day, and he came back with dirt under his nails, something like that. Like having that very open communication may help may help in these types of situations where they don't get to that point of escalation, or we can be more proactive rather than reactive when we see someone struggling with something or having a hard time. So I think for the most part, for job specific items and making sure someone coming into a job is not going to be stealing from you or hurting the people that they're meant to take care of in a school situation, yes, I think background checks do a great job. But I definitely, like I said, they're not a good indicator of where people's mental health are when they start the job or even throughout the job. So we can't rely solely on those. We still need to have that emotional intelligence and that open culture to keep our company safe.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? I mean, this individual, Mr. Exemplary Employee, obviously he'd been there for some time.
Yeah.
So, maybe they did background check, and how do you watch for when that person, how do you know when they're going to snap, right? Like what, and that's the hard part to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not something that anyone could know. And I think in this situation, there's a lot of those feelings probably in that workplace. I imagine, like, putting myself in the shoes of just fellow employees that worked with that employee. Like, I imagine I should have seen it. I should have known.
Yeah.
Oh, he was acting weird that day. I should have said something, kind of that like guilt, or even, those feelings of sadness, and obviously just dealing with some very big emotions and being able to reach out to resources like companies that offer EAP. EAP is a great resource when employees have to deal with this. And it doesn't always have to be a situation like this, because obviously this is definitely more of a one-off situation. This isn't something that a lot of HR professionals are probably ever going to experience in their career. But there's a lot of companies that have lost employees, like tenured employees who've been there for 20 years and they just, pass away of normal, causes, and employees still deal with those types of feelings. So having those resources available is really, really important to employees, because there's a lot of ways that situations like this can affect them and, trigger cultural changes or, temporary cultural shifts in your organization, and being able to bring that back and recenter it by leveraging your resources is really kind of the key role that HR plays in these types of situations.
Yeah. You mentioned EAP.
Yeah.
So I know what that is, but why don't you tell I was missing viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So EAP, can't speak now, is Employers Assistance Program or Employee Assistance Program. So it is a program that employers can pay into. It's typically employer paid, and it allows employees to call in to an anonymous number, or excuse me, to call into a number anonymously, and they can get counseling sessions, they can get help with their personal financial situations. Sometimes the certain programs offer legal assistance at a discounted rate. So if they're dealing with something in their personal lives, it helps employees have a resource to handle it before it escalates to that point where they start becoming a danger to themselves or others. So it does allow employees to have those types of resources whenever, they express any type of concerns. And the nice thing about outsourcing that to a third-party vendor is that the employer doesn't have access to any of that information. Everything is anonymous. If the employee wants to keep it anonymous, they are provided references to psychologists or therapists or lawyers that are outside of the employer's kind of scope of information within the EAP program. So it just offers employees a resource that they're not afraid of being retaliated against or the information leaking to other employees in the organization. So having that third party resource is a huge, I would say, buffer for employers to get the employees the help they need without getting information that they really shouldn't have access to that could create a conflict of interest at any time in their employment.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we have, obviously we have an EAP employee assistance program here at Puzzle. It is a great benefit. It is incredibly underutilized. I wish more people would take advantage of it.
Yeah.
If you're listening and your company's got an EAP plan, read the brochure, go to the website. Brochure, it's 1987. Go to the website, see what services it can provide you, and take advantage of them. It doesn't cost anything. It's a benefit your employer is providing. You really should take advantage of it. If you're a business leader, they don't cost a heck of a lot of money, and it really is a really good benefit for your employees.
And another thing too is managers don't realize this, but it's a great resource for them as well to learn more information on, kind of explore your EAP so you know what it offers. So if an employee comes to you during a one-on-one is having a hard time, you already know what's available and you can speak to it. If you can speak to it, the employees are more likely to use it as well. And if you've used it as a manager, like telling them, hey, I've used it and it was a great help to me, it's more likely that employee is going to use it. So really just encouraging your management team to kind of explore in that EAP program and, test it out for a couple of different things and really kind of be able to speak to that is going to help encourage their employees. And again, proactively protect your organization.
Yeah, that is a really, really good piece of advice, Grimes. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back and let's talk a little bit about crisis management and communication, right?
Yeah.
So this lady was on her own and had to had a little trial by fire, right? To say the least. How can companies better equip their team with the tools and trainings needed for kind of these unexpected crises, especially regarding communication with external parties like media and police and things like that?
Yeah. I think in situations like this, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a business continuity plan, but there are kind of pieces to it that it really is a business continuity plan, especially when you have a key person like the owner out of touch. It's not like he was just in another country on a different time zone and couldn't be bothered. He was going to be on a flight. You weren't going to be able to contact him. So really having a plan for what happens and who's next in command. I don't recall if this person indicated what their position was, but I imagine they were some kind of HR professional. But typically the owner of the company should have some type of vice president, COO, something like that would step in times like this and really having that continuity plan of, perhaps the CEO and the VP and the president should not all be on vacation at the same time. Just kind of having some of those plans in place for when these things do happen. As far as handling logistical stuff, though, especially if it involves local police or law enforcement, a lot of the times, they're very instructive on what they need from you as a company. A lot of the times, really all they ask and all they need is cooperation. However, I will say the caveat to that is 100% anytime police are involved or it has to do with an employee's personal life, but unfortunately it encroaches on the workplace, I would say legal counsel. If you do have in-house legal counsel, keeping them in the loop so they can provide you guidance on what you should be doing from a legal standpoint to protect yourselves, because at that point, that early in the investigation when they were first coming to get the employee, at that point they have no idea what the employee did or what potential liability there was to the company. So at that point, knowing that legal counsel would need to be involved and, aware of the situation is important as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. Now, last thing on this one, what about policies? Should the company sort of review and update their policies and protocols, and make sure they align with, we'll call it, evolving workplace challenges and scenarios? Like, what should companies do today to make sure that they're prepared for, God forbid, something even half as horrific as this?
Yeah, I would say there's a balance to it. I've seen organizations that updated their handbook every time for every situation, and the handbook gets very redundant and very repetitive, and sometimes even conflicting when you are updating for every situation and you're not reading the context of the rest of the handbook. And handbooks are lengthy documents. A lot of people don't have time to read the full 50 to 100 page document every time they need to update it. So you don't necessarily want to update your handbook and policies in a reactive way, but I think having that conversation when situations happen and say, okay, could this have been prevented, or do we need additional documentation to protect our organization, and reset an expectation with employees in the future? So definitely reviewing your handbook at least on an annual basis to stay up to date with just general legislation changes is important, but also cultural changes. I think when people read their handbooks, they don't always have their culture in mind. And when leaders read through the handbook, they really need to say, does this speak our culture's language? Does this perpetuate our values? Are the policies in here, like if we have a very strong value in moral integrity, but we don't have a zero tolerance policy for violence or aggressive behavior, why is there not that, consistency there? And really having those conversations around your values and possibly updating your values. I mean, companies, just because you have values that you started 10 years ago aren't necessarily the values you have now. So having those conversations around, what do we need to improve upon? What do we need to discuss? And where do we need to make changes? I think is really important at the leadership level before you just go and react. Because I think the reactionary part, if you don't think through it, it's not going to do what you intend it to do.
What about like an operational routine around policy and handbook review? Like once a year, once every 6 months, once a week, once every 10 years, never?
I would say best practice is at least once a year. I personally always tell my clients to review their handbook in January, February. It's typically slow for most businesses. Q4 tends to be busy for a lot of businesses closing out their fiscal year. But not only that, we see the most legislative changes at the state and federal level, typically in October, November, December. Right now, we're getting a bunch of compliance updates for all the things the states have voted in or governors have, signed bills for, and how that goes into effect either January or July of next year. And so a lot of those changes need to be communicated to the employees. We need to have the handbook updated so the employees have a resource. So I would say best practice at the bare minimum, look at your handbook on an annual basis, at least for the compliance changes. I would say culturally, that should always be in the back of your mind. But I tell leaders that I think you should revisit your values and your cultural definition with your leadership team at least once every 5 years, or anytime you hit a huge milestone in your growth. So if you're a startup company, you might be hitting milestones every year. You need to look at your culture and your values every year to shape where it's going. If you're a more established company, maybe your milestone was going public and going public and having stocks, or maybe it was getting so big that you have a full executive team and you're now governed by a board of directors. That's a great time to take a look at your values with your leadership team and really reconnect and make sure everybody is on the same page as far as where the company is going to go for the next milestone. So those are my typical best practices and tips for leaders that are trying to figure out, how often to discuss culture and values and kind of the foundation of their company.
That's great stuff, Grimes. It really is. So what do you think of our two stories this episode?
I thought they brought some good questions and some good situations. Definitely some obviously sad stories, and stories that are very extreme on the spectrum in terms of what an HR person would experience in their career. But I think as examples, I think they gave us great talking points, and I'm glad we can provide that information to our listeners.
Well, I will tell you what, apparently there are, what they say, 1 million stories in the Naked City or something like that. There are plenty of them.
I'm sure we could talk all day about the stories on the internet.
Okay, absolutely. And we will in our next episode of You Can't Spell Horror Without HR. I want to thank you all for listening. Again, I'm your host, Chris Timol.
And I'm Brianna Grimes. Thanks for joining us, y'all.
We appreciate like and subscribe, and we'll catch you back on the next episode. Have a great rest of your day.
You have been listening to You Can't Spell Horror Without HR podcast, brought to you by PuzzleHR, Human Resources Solved. If you like this podcast, please subscribe to our channel to stay notified of new exciting episodes. To learn more about PuzzleHR, visit us at puzzlehr.com/podcast. Thank you for listening.